Good evening, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Mwenya. It is my pleasure to be moderating this discussion today. As you have heard from Level, the title of our conversation is Heritage and Spirit. And our guests, who I will introduce briefly in a moment, are Gogo Khanyakude, Azah Mphago, Jay Pather, and Motsane Siabela. So this session will address some of the different ways that heritage is constituted in the context of African spiritualities and indigenous knowledge systems. It will consider what some of the questions are to be asking of museums and other heritage spaces that collect, preserve, and display in a particular way. We'll consider what ideas and terminologies continue to be restrictive and what practices already exist that can help us rethink a relationship between heritage spaces and African spiritualities. In the interest of time, we have 1 single hour for a conversation that, as Lebo has said, really should be a conference on its own. We will take every second of that hour. But in the interest of time, I'm going to read just a small section of each of the guests' bios, and I really encourage you to look at their extensive profiles. They're all doing incredibly interesting and vital work, and have been for a long time. And their full bios are on the website, and I really encourage you to look at them. After I've introduced everybody, we will each guest will approach the topic in a 5 to 7 minute provocation, and that will be followed by a discussion amongst us up here, and then we'll open the room for any questions, and that's the flow of the discussion. Cool. So I'd first like to introduce Gogo Khanyakude. Gogo Khanyakude is a queer, two-spirited Sangoma, mindfulness teacher, and diversity and inclusion advocate. They are thought leaders in the field of embodied decolonization and co-create inclusive and just bodies, communities, and societies. They are also the CEO of Ukudloza Indigenous Knowledge Consultancy. Welcome. I'd also like to introduce Azah Mphago, who is a multi-instrumentalist, composer, and producer. Azah is an award-winning transdisciplinary creative practitioner and indigenous knowledge systems specialist. He is a sonic healer, thespian, singer-songwriter, educator, music director, and cultural activist from the jazz capital of South Africa, Mamelodi. Welcome. I'd like to introduce Motsane Siabela, who is currently the Curator of Anthropology at Ditsong Museums of South Africa. She's currently pursuing a PhD in Heritage Museum Studies from UP. Her research hinges between anthropology, heritage, and museum studies and history, and she has taken interest in oral histories, provenance research, women's histories, indigenous conservation, and indigenous conservation perspectives. Her recent publication and co-curated exhibition deals with the preservation of museum collections as an inherited obsession and asks questions on how to confront and break away from such practices. And then we have Associate Professor Jay Pather, who is the director of the Institute of Creative Arts, formerly GIPCA. He is the founder and director of Suela Sonke Dance Theater that was established in 1996, and he has produced over 50 new works with this Durban-based company. He is a committee member for the National Arts Festival and the artistic director of the Afro Vibes Festival. Jay is a Durban-born cultural activist and the recipient of numerous awards for his multiple contributions to the arts and humanities. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome, all of you. Thanks. Thanks.
Thokozani Gogo, Thokozani everybody. I'm going to begin today by calling in the land, our ancestors, and the divine intelligence which runs through the spirit of Ubuntu, which what exemplifies us as South Africans, I believe, central theme in our heritage. So in your own ways, this is not sectorial invitation, but to whatever you connect with to source that divine intelligence, to Creator, we're just calling it in. And I'd like to those who feel welcomed, if you could join in as I speak, which is the bringing together of the palms to begin to make a sound. Thokozani. Siyakhuleka kini bogogo nabomkhulu, sikhuleka kuwena khokho wasembo, wena nina wasembo, la sesizabuka khona sonke. Sifikile thina sifikile la endzaweni asikadidelanga. Sibitwa nginini labadzala, sibitwa nginini bogogo nabomkhulu. Sine njengoba sihlangane la sitawukhuluma ngemdzabu wethu, sitawukhuluma ngemvelo yethu, sitawukhuluma ngebuntu bethu, sikhulume ngesintfu sethu, singawukhohlwa nemhlaba wethu kwantu. Sicela ukuthi kube indumandumane, namhla ukuthi tindlebe tibe sesiyadziva, namhla sibe sesiyabonwa kungabonwa mina ngedwa, kubonwe nini emakhehla, kubonwe nini nonke nakithi basembo. Akube kuhle kube mhlophe kudede bumnyama kube sekuvela bukhanya. Thokozani. Welcome everybody. Now that we've seen what the natives get up to, let's do a bit of talking and sharing. That is my birth name. That name carries so much heritage within it. When I say the name Tisetso, firstly, it has a meaning: perseverance, indomitability, patience, allowance. That within itself is a call to action, but also in my body, it represents a connector to me and my ancestors' way of being. See, the name Tisetso came by way of dreams. When my mom was pregnant with me, she dreamt of this name. And when I was born, I was, horrible, taught like infant to have, because I cried and I turned blue. And that resulted in having to go to my paternal side, which is one of the most beautiful places in the world. I come from Hlabegisa, opposite the potholes, where Graskop is and that beautiful view is. And my grandmothers had to perform a sacred ceremony. Which means that when a child is born, it's both a new soul and an ancestor returning. And certain children, when born, will cry out for a particular name and for particular rites to be performed so that we can be anchored within our path and our purpose in this life. I am the last grandchild in my lineage to have that rite performed. So within my name, within my body, within my experience is so much heritage. There's so much within just a name. I begin with names because often when we come into these spaces, we become so obsessed with object, discovery, and when we do name, we always single. We will, when we speak about the quick immediately what comes to your mind is Sarah Batman. What of all the others? What of all their names? What is there for us to be with in those names? And this is a very interesting provocation, because for many of us, we would say that the names, the knowledge, the history, the culture, the practices, within which I've just shared in a small bit around my history, how could we access that if these individuals are no longer here? it's interesting that scholars will have words for concepts or phenomenon or beliefs or worldviews. So in indigenous worldviews, in our ways of being and knowing, we understand that everything is alive, so nothing ever dies, which is why we connect to our ancestors, which from a quantum realm we could call matter. From a religious perspective, we could call it spirit or the divine. And what we call our ancestors, and to other people, they call it energy. But there's a common understanding across all disciplines that there is an intangible existence which is always concurrent with this materially embodied existence that we can see and experience in our five senses. As now I come here, I've been introduced now as Gogo Khanyakude, which brings me to another nuance of names. Khanyakude mabuza mshengu shabalala tfonga lamavuso lophanako lo wagwadla beta muntu ngekwakhe wahamba buta ukuthi bondlebe nabo shabalala bashonaphi nine lenacetsa libombo ngekuhlehletela. That is our museum. And I begin by naming it first as a museum before I explain what I just did, because that is my clan praise for my great-great-grandmother. Her surname was Mabuza, and within it, it names Ninelena Tsetsa Libombo Ngekhlehletela. Libombo, the Lubombo Mountains. Let's maybe journey there for a bit as to how does this name, this clan praise, connect with that. Some of you may know, and those of you that don't know, there was the Lubombo bone which was found at the Lubombo Mountains, which is the oldest lunar calendar from Mphago fibula, which has 28 ridges and follows a woman's cycle. So now I come into this space and I say, this name, this clan praise, this Tagazelo, connects me as a brown body, a black body, to immediately not thinking of Aristotle and the great Greeks as being master teachers to the world, but brings me to the here and now in my country, in my lineage, to recognizing that that clan praise, that Tagazelo, is the way within which we have archived in our family that we have always been knowers, that we have always been around knowledge production. As I am sitting here, embodied, continuing the work in one of my many capacities, again speaking to the power of names. When we really start for me to journey into indigenous ways of being and knowing, I don't like to share a lot on it because there's so much that is written. UKZN has amazing academic articles and research that's been done internationally. SOAS is one of absolute gems that you could read up on more of this phenomenon and how it interfaces. But what I'd like to speak to today now is around how in this space where I have archived so much heritage, museums within just this embodied space, how come we do not have a Sangoma or Sangomas as keynote speakers? As the bodies of us as Togoza Sangomas become archives, we are libraries, we are museums, we are embodied knowing and being. In this moment, I am speaking from I as myself, but I'm not I as myself because there is an anthology of people in my blood, which comes with an anthology of knowing. In modern day talk, we speak around epigenetic trauma, cellular remembrance, intergenerational transference. There's many ways within which it's languaged. And that pathology is often problematized in our contemporary times. Yet, my ancestors of antiquity have always understood that the blood speaks. Ingadi yakhuluma. We've always understood the importance of beginning heritage from an embodied place, from a direct source, because within that you can start to access so much of the external and begin to understand it. I'll pause a bit there around how we could explore and the invitation to really start to center us as culture keepers into these spaces, because you can't discuss heritage without the custodians as recognized by the land. And speak maybe to another piece that really touches me when I think around the space we're in. I came to Cape Town for first year in 2009, and that's when my spiritual awakening happened. I started having these experiences where I didn't go to varsity. I just couldn't go. I'd wake up and I just couldn't go. And for years after, 5 years after, I narrated it to myself as my ancestors came and interrupted me from being able to get a degree because they wanted me to initiate. Yet, in 2016, I believe, I would discover from somebody who was working at UCT at the time that the current economic center is built upon the graves of slaves. I am called to honor, to preserve, not just the remains, but even just the memory of those who have passed on. So that energetically, for me, created a push and pull. And may or may not, research can be done. I mean, science has a space within it where we could research as to what activations are there by occupying certain spaces. Yet that has been my reality. And I sit here now, and this was 2016, and we're in 2024. We're speaking about heritage, we're speaking about archives, but we're not speaking around so much which can be fixed in the here and now. I'm doing yoga teacher training around Dunkley Square, close to St. Cyprian's, one of the most prestigious private girls' schools. Another site where an initiate of mine, Atwasa, who I initiated, she attended the school there and also experienced issues sleeping and would see all of these spirits and have these dreams. What is also there on top of St. Cyprian's? The bodies of black and brown bodies, the chains, the remnants of those horrible acts. We just came yesterday from Izigo, a beautiful space, yet why are we fossilizing, because it's fossils, those seals, and not to disregard nature. But I believe heritage archiving and museums should speak to the needs of the country. Our country needs healing. The erasure of so much which is here and the obsession with going to discover sites which are far away and removed from people, for me really is another just thought I'm throwing out into the consciousness. How can we start to consider part of what heritage means to us now as starting to do ritual in those spaces? I'm not asking for the UCT Economic Center, which at a time was one of the best in the world, to be torn down, but I'm asking for ritual to be done. I'm not asking for St. Cyprian's to be torn down. I'm asking for ritual to be done. Ritual, which is not performative, is very real to so many of us here that, as Lebu has said, we're on your TVs, we're on radio, we're in every mainstream space. The cultural visibility of particularly South African indigenous ways of being expressed through Bungoma, Bunyangas, Tunywa, and all the other various modalities is brilliant and has led to this global awakening. Yet, cultural visibility does not translate into systemic power. And in these spaces, if we're looking at reimagining, we need to take those who are recognized within the land and our ways of being and center them in those, in the center and the nexus of power, and remove this obsession with having cultural keepers or indigenous people just as this cultural visibility where we'll come and we'll perform a song. Thokozani.
Thank you. Thank you. Azah, would you like to follow?
1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Tobel. There's a lot that we need to know. The so-called objects don't want to be called objects. For the longest time, my people have fought for the rights to be seen as people. So there is the seeing that has been absent. There's also the forgetting. Some people in other parts of the world, as we speak, are experiencing occupation, violence, because other people in another part of the world have forgotten how to be human. So, in the context of my ancestral heritage, there is a fascination with what is now coined Ubuntu, Ubuntu. And this Ubuntu becomes then a qualitative process of becoming. It is founded on behavior. And in my language, we can also see it and recognize it in what is called siriti, isitunzi, or the aura. And therefore the aura, depending on how people behave, can disappear. Or the aura, depending on how people behave, it can gain an arsenal with which we can therefore negotiate a superior becoming in other realms. This is the kind of knowledge that also is testament to the kind of complicity to how the science community is equally guilty. Because if we don't acknowledge certain things in our process of being, if we don't understand or don't acknowledge that scientists are also thieves, if we don't acknowledge that the whiteness is denuded of Butu, because whiteness has failed to maintain Butu. I don't know if you get what I mean. Whiteness has become obsessed with being removed from the conversation of Butu. Therefore, whiteness becomes threatened by peace. In the process of Butu, we are given names, and these names are sites of memory from which we are composed into a frequency. And that frequency allows us to access better versions of ourselves. Therefore, if you are a black-bodied scientist, you are not just a face in a crowd. Therefore, you cannot afford to be just a neutral, another face in the crowd. There has to be a shift in our quest to become human again. And as African people, we have time and time over again invited the whiteness to come into the arena and say, would you like to be human once again? And once again, whiteness, this fallacious assumption that whiteness has a type of conscience with which we can engage again. To our own disappointment, we are left alone in that arena. But we can't give up. We can't despair, and we can't give in to this existentialistic view that we can never be better again. We have to rally that belief that it is possible for this world to become a better place. It is possible to reimagine whiteness as something far more giving than just an obsession with distraction. This is the kind of memory that the so-called objects are about. This kind of, you see, we come from a tradition of uttermost respect. So the so-called methodologies around the handling of so-called objects. If you don't know what you have in your store case, how do you even know how to handle it? Do you know that how we handle our dead, only certain kind of people are allowed to accompany the dead? What he was talking about, huikilela. It's not everything we do. So you are a scientist, you are carefree about how you enter into spaces that has got the so-called remains. These are not just remains to us. This is the evidence of our divinity. And we can't allow you to continue arresting it for your own gaze. We are here to free it. We are here to free our God. We are here to remember again. We are here to refuse to be reduced into nothingness. Because you came here, you told us we can never amount to anything. You told us we can't read. Yet, there was a memory that was contrary to that said, no, we build civilizations. We build civilizations. And this erasure then suggested that, no, in fact, the women folk were inferior. And we are here to refuse that. Because according to our code, our matrilineal society have always acknowledged women as just another superior God. And these are our mothers. We come from a beautiful people. These are kind of reimagination that may somewhat unearth discomfort. Again, there is a type of chance that can allow us to heal. I want to invite you into this possibility of healing. But healing also allows you to acknowledge that you had not been completely truthful with yourself. And I don't want to engage with you from a position of guilt, because that's a little bit trivial, you know. But the accountability of becoming human, it's not just something that you loosely translate. Oh no, Ubuntuism is not. No, it is a chance for us to be gods again, and therefore we have to re-engage differently. And now, as we're taking onto this healing, the first thing that we must do is to take a position. I want to invite you into this journey as I round up this possibility of healing into this sonic. Whoa, 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 whoa. Yeah. Whoa, 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 whoa. My oh, my oh, my oh, my oh. Whoa, 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 whoa. Whoa, 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 whoa. Whoa, 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 whoa. Kadina kaya sabayo na komu ya bumonari. Kama kutu ya ragayo na komu ya bumonari. Whoa, 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 whoa. Whoa, 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 whoa. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Every time when you enter the space where dead people reside, the spaces that you have, these tombs that are called museums, just remember that respect. So-called handling is not about you putting gloves. Handling means that I'm not qualified to touch the remains of a king. Who am I? Science is a lie, therefore. If you don't have that registered in your conscience, you are not qualified. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. What time would you like to follow?
Ke a leboga. Thobela. I occupy what they call, or my title is called, a curator in a museum, in a cultural history museum. And I've been entrusted with looking after an ethnographic collection. It's a very problematic collection. And already the terms that we use, the terms I'm mentioning now, are problematic in themselves. And through the journey and through the years that I've been in this position, I have come to realize that it is not just about me, but it's about us. It's about my people, it's about the African people, And I agree that it's impossible as a Black person in these spaces to say you can be objective. It's just not possible. And I've come to realize that by removing, by dispossessions and dislocations of these ancestral belongings from the places of descent, have resulted in a forced convergence of spirits. Spirits that are disgruntled, that are hurt, that are continuously violated on different levels through different forms. But it's also spirits that are resilient and relentless, and they are fighting. And personally, I will speak from personal experience of just being in this space. And I've also come to realize that I'm not just a curator, but I have been placed in this position and this space to heal more than anything. And how it's important that as people who are called professionals, curators, and other museum professionals, we need to move away from this obsession with power and authority, particularly in Africa, and understand that museums are less of places of preserving the material, but we should move towards understanding that they are also, to a great extent, places of death. And we must allow the natural death of these objects, what are called objects, which are our ancestral belongings, to die. And some of the conscious decisions that I've taken as a curator, which I'm not, have made me not to be popular, is also that us touching some of these ancestral belongings with permission, of course. So constantly, I negotiate with the space. I cannot work in that space without having to negotiate and asking for permission, but because it's not every day that I can work in that space, sometimes they just wouldn't allow me to work in the space. And you have cupboards, you have boxes that which I have not even gone closer to them because I'm not allowed, I'm not qualified, and that's why it's very important to me that we go back and look back into the future by looking and tapping into our indigenous knowledges and the holders to help us in dealing with these ancestral belongings. And museums, to me, they should be treated as places where these ancestral belongings are in transit, because they should go back to where they were taken from or allowed to die, because we have a lot of them that museums have tried to treat them as immortal. They are not immortal. They should be allowed their natural death. And just working in this space, it's impossible not to incorporate, not even incorporate, but using indigenous knowledge ways to take care of this material. It's impossible when you are sitting in this space and on the other side there's a drum beat, and yet you know that physically it's just you but spiritually, there's just a whole lot of other people. So as practitioners, as people who are sitting in these privileged positions, it's important that we recognize it's not just about us. So I long for the day when we embrace the death that needs to happen in these spaces while these ancestral belongings are still in transit. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have to have notes. Forgive me. It's just fascinating for me in the presence of my fellow panelists to bring us to the point where in this entire conference, and I think in many conferences like this, when we talk about museums or about receptacles of culture or heritage, when we get to the aspect of spirit, there is nowhere to hide. Because I think it really brings us into a space of authenticity and truth about what it is we're talking about. And it made me think when you were talking about remains and what remains. I was thinking about a play I directed by Nadia Davids about the remains at Prestwich Place, which I think some of you may be aware of, which, there was some high-rise in a typical Cape Town way, a high-rise apartment for the middle classes being built, and while they were building, they found these graves, of course, and then the bones were moved and put into an ossuary. But the crux of my story is that no one really goes to the ossuary except tourists, of course, and young tourists from Europe and America looking for free Wi-Fi and good coffee. There's a coffee shop there, the Truth Coffee. So it's as far away as you can from what the circumstances of that space are and what they mean. And it made me think a little bit of, because I'm also talking as a curator and as a curator of performance and live art festivals that very, very often traverse as we become more and more connected to performance, not as representation, but as of presentation, of being and not translating being. And as we begin to do that more and more, that kind of work, I began to be more aware of how our the ongoing coloniality project is about constantly containing. Yeah, we have to keeping it down, keeping it contained, labeling it, making it palatable, making it possible for it to be read. And the question is, by whom? And, we can recall Fanon's double consciousness here. Who do we talk for? And who are we talking to? And how do we change our gait and our languaging to appease who? Who's hosting this conference, and who are we talking to? And how are we containing what we are trying to say? Because, in the last 2 months, well, some could argue in the last 15, 20 years, the moral compass, the so-called moral compass that the West has supposedly led, has revealed itself. It has revealed itself to be not existing. It has revealed itself more than any time before in the last couple of weeks, in the last 2 months, to be a ruse for the constant development of its own power. And that power can only be articulated by this constant stopping of the overflow. So even when I think about the title, reimagining heritage, we're constantly having to do the labor of reimagining, of reworking, of renaming, of redoing. Why don't we just remove? Because it's there. That which is heritage, as Siraj Rasool talks about as a process, is there. There is nothing to reimagine. There is nothing to remake. But there's a lot to remove. There is a lot to take away. And there is a lot. There is a lot that holds back and keeps the so-called overflow, the spillage, out and done. And when, of course, the performance to Cecil John Rhodes in Rhodes Must Fall was about that overflow, was that final overflow, was that one moment that could address that concrete heritage, that part of heritage that remains so steadfast as if it was unshakable, and it shook it. And so I think a lot of what we're talking about then may be also about terminologies and how words are used. I was in a lovely panel discussion with artists, 5 artists and a curator, and to evoke whiteness and race, the curator was white, and there were 2 white artists and 3 black artists. And curator kept talking about the traditional elements of the black artists. And despite the fact that 2 white artists were doing ceramics and painting, you couldn't get more traditional than that. So the whole meeting ground of the contemporary, of what is contemporary, becomes reified and becomes, again, contained into lineage as opposed to what is, because we're not able to define that. And this is where it gets, I guess, to another problem around terminologies, which is the issue of modernity. Yeah? We forget very often that modernity was a colonial project. Yeah? It was very convenient because it was a swear word up to a point to call it colonial. So let's just call it modern. The fact that it is European is besides the point. It's modern. So everything else, every single thing is primitive. Everything beyond what is defined by modernity is primitive and is or traditional or is in some way in another time warp. And therefore, it needs to be contained. Yeah, it needs to be whipped into submission and disciplined and placed in certain formats that are readable and identifiable. So I guess the session is really, I had a whole bunch of notes, which I'm not even going to read, but it really, with my colleagues talking in the way you did, made me then bring me to the question of curatorship as well. And this is something I do want to read. I wrote an essay called The Impossibility of Curating Live Art, and I write, I would like to extend the idea of the increasing the invisibility of the curator in the name of taking care of live art. In starker terms, for the curator to die in the process as a way to conceive of curation in times of change and crisis, to cease to live and interfere. In the creation of presence, to disappear completely may be the most productive strategy. A a curatorial approach that refines and redefines the edges of involvement and disengagement, seeking out the delicate balance between those two positions in order to give life to work that always was, that are probing and provocative while remaining speculative and unknowable. Because as we start curating work in performance festivals, etc., and as artists begin to be fed up of performing, of constantly performing to a gaze, to a particular kind of gaze, as performers are more interested in the doing and are moving into spaces of healing and are working in the interface between ritual and gathering, because that's also contentious and controversial. How does one bring ritual into performance? Some artists are comfortable with that, some are not. But as they begin to do all of that, as they begin to do all of that work, there is a lot that we have imposed on these heritages, on our heritages, that are needing a great deal of displacing and of taking away. And there are issues around space and when and how. I loved last night, and I loved meeting everybody, but to what extent that spiritual performance became a bit like a background music, when we were more interested in filling our champagne glasses and our wine glasses, but it's not, it's two events. And that was an event. And so it's not that both couldn't exist, but there was a different sense of time and a totally different sense of space that we need to invoke. And as a curator, I've walked into those kinds of paradoxes, and we really cannot afford anymore, especially when we go into areas of spirit, which I think last night was so much about, notion, sense of space and sense of time, and how these great, huge elements are being redefined so fast and so finely that our regular curatorial languages and the languages of our current museums, etc., cannot accommodate it. So they can't be reimagined. They need to be removed in many respects, and for these spaces to be created. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. This is such rich input, and I want to start by asking if any of you want to pick up on any comments or provocations that anyone else has put forward as a beginning. Anything that you want to pick up on and run with?
Yeah, Gogo and Azah spoke about opening up the spaces, the museum, and allowing rituals and all these practices to be performed. And he was using different spaces in Cape Town to say it's not, as healers are not asking much, but just the space to perform these rituals. And in a museum, and particularly, yes, where I work, I know I will not be able to do, as much as I'm in that space to heal and called to heal, I cannot do that alone. I need all these healers, all these indigenous knowledge holders to co-curate, and this term co-curating and co-producing is also constantly being used, but a lot of the times it's only when there's this project or this public programs, event or whatever, but the knowledge holders, the healers, the different cultural leaders needs to be in these spaces continuously. This co-curation needs to happen on a continuous basis. And curators, like you were saying, curators really need to take many steps back and allow curators in Africa. We are dealing with African spaces and material, so we need to stop importing this Western ways of doing, which is what we've been doing for the longest time. And that's how I also got to the work I was doing on inherited obsessions, to say we are so obsessed with preserving and with international standards of preserving, but they're just Western ways of preserving. And Africans have always had their own ways of conserving. We just do not have one term to say we are doing conservation. It's multiple ways of us restoring and conserving all these things. If you are going to go to the river to get reeds and restore a basket, it's something that is in us. It's you don't have to even give it a name. It comes organically. So we just need to move from this obsession. So it's something that I was grappling with, to say we are so obsessed and we inherited all these things that were done by our predecessor, and it's up to us to just stop it. And the issue of language, a few years ago, we had it was a gathering, and someone asked, why is it that the collection that I'm curating, it's still called the Anthropology Collection? The name needs to change. And my response was that changing names, the renaming, and that's what Jay was talking about. We are just renaming things and relearning and doing this and that. And we have different names. On ethnographic collections, you'd have social history, living cultures, indigenous perspectives. But how many indigenous communities were involved in actually renaming those collections? It's still the curators, it's still the so-called experts and the academics who'd come up with these names, these Western names. But if we were engaging more, if we were to engage indigenous peoples more and actually use African names and terms that which are comfortable for us, that which we can relate to. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think I would like to share another point of possible discomfort. Some of these I've got few names that that are coined within the space that I can use. I mean, you sometimes use objects, artifacts, relics, you know, you people. But then it needs to be known that some of these things, upon being repatriated, needs to be destroyed against your liking. because for them to continue to exist for your gaze creates other problems. And some of the response that you get from the West when the people who are hoarding these things, when they are being asked, so are you sure that we can release these things to your care? Would you be able to handle them? No, they need to be destroyed. And destroying them does not suggest that we don't know the value of them. Because we understand that the value of them is far more beyond the material benefits. Colonialism does not have a nightmare about African scientists one day going to exhume Queen Elizabeth Day. So it's not justice, it's just us. And you see, because we have a proverb that says that the sea never refuses any river. And that's how we've managed to become human over and over as Africans. Because we believe that there are many streams to our existence. And I'm so much fascinated with this belief of us becoming better people. I strongly believe in it. Whether black or white, I believe that there is a chance that we can become better people. And part of that becomes then in how we deal with the so-called simple everyday thing. Perhaps then the methodologies themselves have got to be changed. Perhaps then we have to, out of respect, think of the other people. The so-called remains that are in our positions actually belong to an actual family. Because this notion of rest in peace means that the departed should be left alone, somewhere to rest. Well, us as black people, we still have got other issues because we still go there to ask for 1, 2, 3 and a job and this. But that's for us. It's not where that's our own business. We'll deal with our problems, you know. But what I'm saying is that outside of that, I don't know about your museum experiences. In most museums when I go, in fact, the last exhibition that I entered into now of Desmond Tutu, the first experience, the first thing I could hear there is screams. Screams, like, you know, of almost like the same sense of, you know, the Atlantic trade victims and what have you. It's the same feeling that you get when you go to that other one, by that prison in Joburg. Constitutional. Yeah, same. But guess what? Also, when you go to the State Theater, you get the same thing. So we have to also look into these spaces. What secrets, and the kind of awareness also. Because these walls, they speak. If we can hear this wall speaks, we might be able to hear this object speak. And they might just tell us how they want to be handled.
Thank you.
I think I would like to also share something in this brief time. And this is in no way a judgment on my fellow panelists. I love you all. But I really do believe central to what we can start to reimagine in heritage is removing the centering of older people and bringing younger people to be the ones who become the culture keepers. In an earlier session, Nduguyake shared around who are these future generations. And when we imagine anything around heritage, I mean, in this panel, I'm the youngest, and I'm not that young, I'm 34, but I'm still a millennial. You get right? So my perspectives in terms of what heritage means to me and to my generation and even to the Gen Z's favorite generation, long live my 2000 Pambili. And that's my belief. And also for us to start looking into things that we can action, because we've spoken a lot today around problem stating, and perhaps maybe to share around what can be actioned for us moving here. As Jay has said, moving away from curatorship to caretaking, it aligns with our language. Ngesindu, we are nagegela, uyindlondlo, you're a custodian. Moving to spaces of maybe new methodology that looks around what are our qualitative ways, which is the biggest difference between, for me, a circular, empirical-based approach and an indigenous way of being, is it is qualitative, and because it is qualitative, it is localized, and when it is localized, it then actually goes into what Azah was saying around seeing a human, not seeing a concept. And great appreciation also to the work that is being done at Ditsong and the limitations, but also to name that it is always for me so frustrating to think that the Smithsonian, you can go and sage the space, you can perform ritual at the Smithsonian in the United States of America, and we are where here in Africa, I had to request for us to begin this in this way. I'm in talks with certain institutions in Germany to go and perform a ritual of Femba where I evoke my ancestors to be able to recognize and name what each of those objects are. Africa, where are you? My problem with an older generation. Thokozani.
Anything you want to pick up on?
No, I'm fine. We can get to the audience.
Is that the real time? Is that how much? A minute? For real?
For real?
Real, it's a minute, I can't believe
Okay,
it.
so
Nancy, how do we feel? Should we extend for another 5 minutes? Okay, can I make an executive decision? You can hate me for it. Can we take
5 minutes, 5.
We'll have 5.
3?
Oh,
3, none.
yeah, we have to. So while this is being negotiated, this is the time for you to ask some questions.
So, for those who need to leave urgently, you are welcome to leave. Hey, does somebody have a mic that I can use for the translator? For those who need to leave urgently, you are welcome to leave. And then, for those who would like to stay behind, we will extend the discussion by 10 minutes. And there's a second shuttle, so you won't lose the trip to Zeitz. Enkos.
Thank you. Great. Questions, comments, responses from the audience as those who need to leave do. Is there a roving microphone? How are we doing questions from the house? There's one here. Thank you. Hello, hello. You too.
Okay.
This
Yeah.
can, level?
That is number 2, ne?
This one can go to Azah. Azah's is gone.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I really would like to appreciate, I think, the feedback and the
Is Azah's
presentations
microphone
from
on?
the panelists. I have 2 microphones.
That's number 2, man. Sharp.
Number 1 should also be on.
Volume on number 1.
Pass it back, man, like you did when you were kids in school.
Which
Pass
one?
it like a cousin and road. Oh, my, just. Oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah,
Anarchy.
Yeah, no, I'm interested in finding out because I've been listening very carefully. I think I've picked up a couple of words that you've used. For example, destroy, allow, natural death, remove, as opposed to reimagining. And I want to perhaps maybe get the sense from you, because if the concept of a museum was built on the premise that it collects, it retains, it keeps things, and you seem to be suggesting to us that now we need to enter into a phase where we demuseumize museums. We almost undo, we almost delink the museumness from what it's, from its original intention. And I want to ask whether you are suggesting that in the post-colonial era, that we need to almost, in the processes of reproducing the museum of the future, is that museum of the future, is the demuseumification of museum constitutes the idea that the museum of the future cannot be solely understood in the context of, its collection. So what would a museum look like without a collection? Perhaps maybe I should go back and ask, what is a museum in the post-colonial era? Because if those very, objects that were collected in the context of violence and genocide, and the logical conclusion would mean that if those objects are returned back to the communities, to the people from whom those objects were stolen, so we will be left with an empty museum. Is that the logical conclusion of the kind of a museum that we're seeing in the future? Is that the post-museum? If the very idea of a museum was built on the fact that it collects, it keeps, are we suggesting now that we need to de-museumize museums in order to museumize museums? That's what I'm trying to understand. Thank you very much.
Please, yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much, sir, for your inquiry. And I think for me, I'll begin it because you're speaking about construct and deconstruct. The understanding that we have museums is a social construct. It was at a point we decided that we're going to create this for the needs of these people, and we're going to have a building to do this. So in any social construct, it can be deconstructed to be reconstructed. And what to come in for me personally to speak around museums and the particular around sacred objects and them not being objectified. If someone should take my shoba, this is a sacred item, without my consent, without the blessings, there are two things which could happen, which happen. Within my lineage, they have failed to be custodians of this shoba. So a generational curse or epigenetic trauma of that remembrance that our sacred item, lishoba, which is supposed to be passed on generation to generation, now it doesn't just fall upon my nucleus family, but across all of the surnames that I come from, because I'm not born from a mother and a father. Our understanding of identity is not from a patriarchal, patrilineal perspective. I walk with 3,000 ancestors, so this will affect 3,000 ancestors and different various lineages. We understand. We know of families that have certain behaviors where there's just a pathology of no progress, and no matter where you meet that surname, whether it's in the Eastern Cape or in Gauteng, same destructive behavior. Perhaps that's where it comes from. Certain sacred objects which are kept and are not meant to be there. Then again, also in the spaces within us there, we've heard from a practitioner around the experiences which are had with objects which are not meant to be kept within those realms and within those parameters. And if we're speaking around anything that has to do with our ways of being, we cannot look at decoloniality from a two-dimensional perspective where it's circular and it's mechanical. We must center the spiritual consideration, and that means that certain things are sacred, and in the wrong spaces, they cause harm. Togoza.
Does anybody else would like to respond to what the Museum of the Future might look like if we are museumifying it?
Well,
the death that I was referring to is the physical death, because now they are sitting there, but the spirituality will always exist. The intangible heritage will always exist. So we can always be left with that knowledge, with that history. So that is the death that I'm referring to. But their lives are never going to be seized.
I approach things, I think of myself more of a spiritual materialist, actually. Because I think, we can talk a lot. I've learned over my years I can talk in poetic language about what the future is, but if the material circumstances haven't changed, it's a bit absurd. It's kind of like, I think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was outward-facing largely. It was beautiful what happened, but a lot of it was a presentation to the world. It was almost like a performance, like a theater for the world, right? And the world really indulged in that catharsis and were really excited about it, as well as the minority population in South Africa that, were able now to retain wealth without a conscience anymore. So when we have to, I guess we have to, in talking about the future, I'm trying to address the material conditions of the now. And the material conditions has created enormous psychic distension. I don't think there's any disagreement about that. The continual sense of violence on so many different levels has created the psychic distension. These repositories, which we are calling museums, are meant to be spaces which should be addressing that on some level. Something has to give.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Yes. Do you have a microphone? Oh, go ahead, and then we can pass the second microphone. So there's a question at the back, and then we'll come down to you. Great. 1, 2, 3.
All right, thank you. And for me, I wanted to ask about the question of spirit. I take it as a very much sensitive topic, especially spirits. Especially the thinking around the cleansing. How do we begin or start to cleanse without disturbing the spirits? Because once we cleanse, we don't want to disturb those spirits. Because they have, at home where I come from, when you disturb spirits, you just can't live, that's the first part. Especially when you talk about museum, we know for a fact that museum are a crime scene. When do we cleanse the museum without disturbing the spirits of those who were murdered before? That's mine. Thank you.
Thank you. Should we take them all? My co-moderator here. Let's take all three, and then we can respond to all three, because that can't be the real time.
It is.
Okay, no, it's fine. Don't show me the real time. So let's take the question at the back.
It's 18:26.
We'll take the question.
We are almost a half an hour over.
We are.
The function at sites is starting at 7.
Okay.
May I ask, please, ask a question. Please don't give a thesis. With love and respect. And also to our panelists as well. I understand these are very complex issues. We err on the side of brevity, please, with love and respect, because at 5:30 they're kicking us out. So, Azisha.
Two more. So we've got a question at the back and a question down here, and we'll reserve the rest. Thank you.
Hello. Oh, yeah. So, firstly, I just wanted to engage just a little with this idea of death and the future museum. And maybe as a thought of what the museum could be, is if the museum could start thinking of itself as a bridge, that the museum is a space that holds so that these conversations can happen, so that something else can happen afterwards, and not a space that holds permanently, and almost thinking of itself as somewhat of a place together to have these conversations, and to almost think about how do we redress, how do we heal, how do the people who need to come into the space to do this work, almost like, when things are scattered all over the place, the space where you can find these bones and all of these things tend to be museums. And so they are valuable in that way, but I think to move from them being just repositories that keep is thinking of itself more malleable, more loose, less colonial in the we're here, we're staying, and this thing needs to be archival, all of that, but as almost like a bridge. But I wanted to ask about particularly the museum's openness to people coming to the museum saying, I have experienced this and I feel I need to do this here. Because I think that is we talk about how people can address things and people feel all of these things, but there are email addresses you need to find, you have to write this thing, and it's the language. How do you language that I came into the space and it feels like I need to do something in the space? And it's like that thing of how do you become qualified for that thing? I'm not gonna say a lot because time, but yeah, are the museums open for these things in reality, not here for the chats? Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Yonela. Last question. Go ahead.
Just a quick one. So if our bodies are museums, if we are sites of preservation, if we are sites of knowledge, if we are sites of spirits, then why can't the museums be spaces for us rather than objects? Why can't it be human spaces? Why can't we fill up the spaces? And through our own cultural practice and through our own cultural preservation, using our bodies, we pass it on from one generation to the other. Why can't it be something that's alive? And even our objects are nothing. They're not spiritual without our presence. Mm-hmm. That's why when they're sitting in Europe and they're sitting everywhere else, it means nothing, because our value systems are wrong. So why can't our museums be sites of preservation for new value systems? Thank you.
So we are back we've gone into the red about 3 times. We're back in the red, we're deep in the red, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists by way of rapping and responding to close us out, if you feel like you would like to, with a short, sharp response.
Well, I'll just respond to why can't the practice be alive? It is alive, it's embodied here, we've been doing it. I'm iSangoma, I am Gogo, Khanyakude, Mabuza, Google me, you will see. And I'm not the only one. So how can we stop this apartheid that is there, that separates us from being included in the mainstream conversations?
Thank you. Thank you. Would you like?
Yeah, I think Sarah Bartman? No. Sarah Bartman, who was taken to, right? As a living museum, right? So it's the distortion that is a bit problematic. It's if we don't understand. Otherwise, your suggestion would mean that we would be taken again and changed and taken somewhere. I'm coming to that, yes. What I'm saying is that the values, as you're saying, the culture has got to be viewed differently outside of the distorted norm.
Thank you. Thank you. Would you like to?
Well, at least the Digital Museums of South Africa and where I'm working now, we have opened the space for anyone. So if there is a ritual, there is some connection that needs to happen, and you come and say, I feel this, I feel that I need to perform this and that here. You can do that anytime. Whether you have to do that during the day or night, we'll open the space for you.
Thank you.
Dying is not an absence of life.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for staying. Thank you to each of you. Thank you so much, Motsana, Azah, Gogo, Jay. I invite you to keep conversing, invite you to be still and quiet, and off we go.